You're listening to Today at Museum of the Bible. These exclusive conversations with authors, scholars, and specialists visiting the museum focus on how they are currently engaging with the Bible in their lives and work.
Welcome to Today at Museum of the Bible. I'm Charlotte Clay.
And I'm Jeff Cloa.
And today we are joined by author and filmmaker Robert Orlando. Robert's recent film, The Shroud Face to Face, was screened at Museum of the Bible today. Robert, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Love to hear a bit about the film, and maybe if you could just start with telling us how you got into the film industry.
The film industry? That goes back a ways. How did I get into the film industry? It was more of a rediscovery when I was very, very young. I'm saying like preteen. I played around with cameras and wrote scripts, and even in elementary school, I made a short film. But then through my high school years, just getting caught up in other things, and or even early college, at some point, I wanted to rediscover my faith, and along with that came my passion for film. They both returned at the same time, and then I went to film school from there, and on and on and on.
Wow, interesting. Kind of a rediscovery in a couple of ways, huh?
I describe it as almost or like a Renaissance calling, because I didn't see myself as rediscovering my faith to be a pastor or a priest or any. I saw it as more like the spiritual could inform the arts or the creative part. And so I felt like I was in the center of that. I always felt like those two messages came to me at the same time.
Well, I have to ask, you go to the bookstore, go to Amazon, there are a lot of books on the Shroud. You go to YouTube, there's a ton of videos on the Shroud. Why another video or a film on the Shroud and book, by the way, Shroud Face to Face? Why another one?
Mm-hmm. That's what I told everyone until I did it. I really had no interest in coming from a Catholic background. I'm not a relic person, generally speaking. It's hard enough to know it's in the Bible and the basic faith and tradition to the degree in which I practice it. But I had two people who I had worked with and made other projects before, one of which you met today, Jason. And they just kept saying what they were doing and talking about it on and on and on. And at the time, there was a lot of change and turmoil in my own life because my father died. COVID was hitting and changing my business, which I had a studio in downtown Princeton. So the industry was changing. I took a step back. I wanted to go back into my studies, my New Testament biblical studies. So it was a change of time, and I think I was looking for something meaningful. And I remember saying to myself, no films, nothing political, nothing. I just wanted to step back from the white noise and go back into that finer grain part of my brain and say, what could I care about? And I realized I had never studied Jesus, read the Gospels, but had never tried a project on Jesus or something about Jesus. And this gave it a unique way in because it was through an investigative forensic angle. So it was not just quoting scripture or trying to prove what's historical and what's not, but it was a forensic way back in. And I'm film noir and detective fiction is one of my fortes. So I thought that was a good starting point. And I thought if I told it as part of my personal narrative, it might strike a different chord than people arguing in like the History Channel or going back and forth. Like he says this, she said that, he said this. I said if I made it my personal story, people might go on that quest with me.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about that? I know you incorporated your relationship with your father and even your experience carrying across through Jerusalem. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So my father was in his mid-80s, and he wasn't very sickly. He needed to go to physical therapy, and he kept falling down. So it was more a question of rehab and everything. And ultimately, he went to the hospital during COVID, but he really had nothing wrong with his vitals when we checked him out. And I expected him to come live near me, and he was going to go into a long rehab. So for me, it was a chance to be with him again in a new way because he'd finally be out of his house and move on. And then he died suddenly, and it was Christmas Eve. So that had an extra blow to it. So the way he died left me with questions more than that he died. Not that I wanted him to die, but if he had died from something clearly, but it was that we were expecting him to have that return, and then he died. And we're not sure until today. We don't know what the reason was. So having him be taken away like in the way he was left a question of like how was he when he died? Right. I wasn't there. My brother, family was there, but I was not there. I wondered how was he when he died. So sometimes you say how you die matters. So just thinking of it, he kept falling on his face, which is bizarre after the fact, but he kept leaving like mask blood from falling down. He'd have to get cleaned up. And so the idea of a face being shrouded all the time, I'm wondering if this was going in, this is going a little deep here, but I think it had to be affecting me. The idea of seeing the last image of your dad as the face. And so the people who were asking me to do the project kept asking me. And finally I went back to it once and I said, I'm going to take one trip to California and I'm going to like listen to what they say. And that's when I mentioned after the screening today, I was in that dark room and they turned on the Shroud image from a negative from behind, lit it from behind. And once it popped, that clicked like all the dominoes when the people ran back in the library and because I had so many images about the Bible, the wounds, that's what got the icon got me being a visualist too and that kind of triggered it all and all came together. So it was part personal journey, part visual encounter, part my studies and everything else that was going on.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that image from Secundo Pia, right, from 1890.
98.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so influential. Just seeing that image of Jesus has affected so many people, and now
And
it's
the fact
all
that it came,
these years later. You know?
well, it came. So for me, what was striking is when you're looking for hard data, you look for disinterest. Even in biblical studies, you look for disinterested parties who would have no motive. So if we remember correctly, when he was taking those pictures, there was no image on the shroud. It was just an icon being for the exhibition they were doing. It was only when he developed it into the negative. So he didn't even have an interest in finding something when the picture was captured. That's another hard piece of forensics for me.
It's a fascinating story. Yeah, I mean, so Charlotte mentioned you carried a cross through Jerusalem. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
so A, why, and B, how did people respond?
So the way I did it is I mapped it out. I actually studied investigations, like what are the real stages of investigation, even though I knew the genre pretty well, but it's like testimony, forensic evidence, when do you protect the scene of the crime, on and on and on. I had gone through all those phases, but where I wound up after doing the testimonies, the scientific evidence, was that this was a plausible conclusion that this was real. So I went from one and not knowing anything to saying, well, at least the skeptics are not convincing me it's not. So I'm going to stay in the realm of I don't know, and this is plausible, the more evidence that came. But overwhelmingly, as I said, but I'm not going to approach it from a faith perspective. And at the end of it all, if you take the theology out of it, you have somewhat, I'm sure he wasn't simple like in his thoughts and his feelings, but Jesus is like status-wise was a simple man killed on a cross who became the icon of Western civilization. That's an incredible story because there's something ironic about it, if nothing else. If not, so I thought to myself, well, now if I just boil it all down to that, so there's enough plausibility, I don't have to give in to the skeptics. What am I looking at? And it's a crime scene. I said, I need to walk through it. I need to take the steps like he did because I might be missing something that no one else is capturing. So to make it personal in the end would be what the Bible says. The Bible says, like, it's not about learning something. It's walk in my steps to understand this way of life, just like any person. To know them, you have to empathize with their real life. So that was the reason to do it. It wasn't like to showcase anything, just like what would it feel like? And it was interesting, very interesting.
And did you get any people taking cell phone photos of you carrying across through
Some
Jerusalem?
ugly looks. I got some
Mostly
ugly
looks,
looks. It was
ugly
like,
looks, yeah.
Not everyone was Christian saying hello and how you
Of course,
doing.
yeah.
Right,
Of course,
right.
yeah. Good.
So you're speaking of this crime scene. When you're examining the shroud, I guess that could be the piece of evidence from the crime scene. What are the boundaries of the crime scene, or can you take us through that?
Yeah, in the film, we actually create the illusion of putting the yellow tape around a crime scene. But I would say once you get into things like, for instance, people would say it's been painted, but there's no pigment on the linen. So that cancels that out immediately. But so many people would live and die on the idea that it's a painting.
Right.
So then I started I said, okay, let me play, they call it the evil genius. Because even if someone made this up, what a genius to pull this off and have knowledge that no one had. But I started thinking of what were the possibilities if it can't be painted and the photography is not advanced enough to pull this off. You have to get into reenactments. So this is I call my Monty Python moment in the story. I started to think about shooting a reenactment of people were nearly dead, just recently dead, pulled out of their thing and thrown into place, covered in a linen, then hit all the ways, looking at the scriptures to make sure you're hitting it in the right direction. And then that didn't work. Drag that one out. Get enough.
The scene, yeah.
Probably good that you didn't reconstruct that.
Because it would have been so absurd. This is self-proof.
right.
Because it would have been so absurd to do it. It
Yeah.
would have been comedy.
Yeah.
Right.
And I
right.
knew when it's comedy, that means because people are going,
farce,
there's no,
right.
yeah.
Right.
But like things like knowing how the whippings came across his rib cage on both sides proved like the Roman angles of how they would, like they wouldn't have known that, even making this up. But so many things like that. So I quickly got over the skeptic thing, the wholesale skeptic thing.
Right, and could dive down into specific things. Right, interesting. Now you've have a theology degree, obviously biblical studies. How did that impact how you came at the story and the Shroud itself?
I tend to approach it more like religious studies, if that makes sense, not theology.
Okay. Yeah.
So I look at it more like what's the impact of narratives in the form of religions or myth, if you will. What do they capture? What's the values that they speak to the world that organizes culture? Right? Because people live around their rituals and how they practice their culture becomes what the central story is. So by deconstructing the narrative of Jesus was also like investigative, because I was saying, take out the theology that you're looking through the lens of theology. Just look at it in terms of what are the orders of the gospel, what happened during his time, what was crucifixion life, what would a Roman prisoner have done? So I started to look at it that way, and I'm saying all of these things further point toward the crucifixion being matched on this linen. So for instance, one great example is there were thousands and thousands of people crucified, but not any with the crown.
Right.
Okay, so you have the crown, then you have the spear in the side, which was unusual.
Right.
The fact that he was rescued from a tomb, from a first-person testimony in Joseph of Arimathea. This is like a crime scene. This is getting good.
Yeah.
So I started to unpack it and couldn't let go. And I'm saying this story would hold up even if he took all the theology out. So that's how I like to approach my religious studies. Like, how do you go bare bones first to be as scientific as you can before you start building the second and third tier of philosophy, theology. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
So your examination of the Shroud as a potential crime scene evidence intersects the realms of science and religion that are often seen as at odds. How does scientific evidence for the Shroud play into your film?
So we'd have to make a distinction between science and scientism. So the worship of science would be, to me, the same type of formation of approach of like a cult or religion. It means that you presuppose certain things and carve out for yourself the elimination of other things to believe a certain system. So if you say, my starting point of all reality, scientism, is that material things are the only way to explain the world. Okay, you're starting from something that precludes any kind of supernatural phenomena, metaphysical, even ideas that go beyond the material world get thrown out. So I was saying that it's an impossible position to be all science, because there's a faith and a leap to science. And actually some of the greatest scientists were people of faith and did their science because they believed there was a truth beyond themselves that was beyond the material universe. So science is born of faith. So the modern dichotomy, it's a long story, but it's post-19th century Marx. There's a whole bunch of reasons why we can get into like how this philosophically gets in the water. But the fundamental point of wanting to break the thing down and be anti-religious became a movement post-Enlightenment that swung so far the other way that it started eliminating what I think is calling faith superstition. But faith is faith in something. It's not faith for faith's sake, because that's just fideism, they call it, where it's faith for faith's sake, or you're in a loop in your own brain. But it's faith in the story of Jesus. Can you trust the story of Jesus? Can you trust the Shroud is a forensic piece of evidence that points back to the story of Jesus? So if you just follow those steps through, I think it shows the absurdity of a purely scientific thinker. It's impossible. Even me saying that to you is not scientific.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I was impressed, maybe surprised even, that you allowed scholars, people to say, look, it's interesting, but it's probably not real, right? And you laid out reasons it might not be. I mean, that's not unusual in these kind of Shroud things. Usually there's a, here,
Hard
here.
stance,
Now we have a conclusion that it definitely is. So was that intentional, or did you want to be clear that there's still questions, or is that just kind of where you ended up? And
I'd like to believe I was trying to be Socratic and transparent and let whoever, I knew they knew the Bible really well.
Right,
so I figured let's let it fly. But it's so interesting when people would say something like, you can't know if anything is true except for that the shroud is not true. It's self-contradictory. So I
Yeah.
would take these interviews into that space and say,
Yeah.
well, if we're not sure of anything and we're looking for plausibility,
Right.
then you're, convenient. So I did make some of the stronger arguments against the skeptics on there, but these are their beliefs.
Yeah.
I have to honor their beliefs if I'm telling a true story and show that I'm taking into consideration opponents of the book and film while I'm going through it. And again, this was incremental. I hope it comes through in the
Yeah.
storytelling
Yeah,
that I'm
build the
going with
story.
it, trying to stay honest to the real progression. So
Yeah.
I don't come in heavy or going
Right.
the other way.
Right. Right. Well, I think it's just intellectually honest and gives people even if they're on one side or the other, right, a way to connect with the film and get something out of it. Yeah. So
And
I think
I
it's well
thought the
done.
Shroud also was a neutral place because all the three Abrahamic religions believe in Jesus
Right.
for different
Right.
reasons and to
Ways,
different
yeah, right.
degrees, but they believe in a historical Jesus that he
Yeah.
lived at a certain point, and it's a way of talking outside of revelation about something physical
Yeah.
that's in the scientific age, but in the end points all back to history. What you read on that linen points back to a date, a specific time, blood samples. So all of it could become a record of a first century snapshot into this person's life. That could be a discussion for religions, even ecumenically speaking. You could think of it that way.
Yeah. Interesting.
I mean, some of the biggest arguments, you hear about the Shroud for the Shroud not being authentic are the carbon dating and maybe some of the gaps in the timeline. How do you examine those in the film?
Well, the skeptics gave me a gift because they started saying there is no timeline, and you find out there's some timeline. It's not a perfect timeline, and we wish we had more in the timeline. But it's been recorded through history at different points. So the
Right, right.
timeline, yes, it's a decent argument. It's not a strong argument. I think it's a decent argument because you could say, well, better to have a seamless timeline. But how many things actually are that seamless anyway?
That are from
Right.
antiquity,
Right.
right?
So I would say there's like 9 positions, there's maybe more, but at least 9 where it shows up in time and there are big gaps and they could be dismissive of a lot of information, but they're there. That's my first point. The carbon dating, I thought it was a be all end all. I thought when I studied it, but
Yeah.
I didn't realize, like, if I can understand, I mean, I pay attention, but I'm not a scientist. And if I can understand things like when something picks up carbon, it picks up carbon from the whole atmosphere.
Right.
So if it's in a fire, like if the Shroud's in a fire, how
Right.
could it not pick up what the fire is giving off along with what it's had in its
Right.
DNA from going back ancient to all the places it's been? So carbon becomes a very sloppy, open-ended. You have to
Yeah.
respect it because at the time it was the leading science and I understood, and I did respect it till today. I still keep that as a leading critique of it, of the Shroud. But then when I saw also like the new technologies and how they're trying to show other ways that carbon is now, again, I'm saying not a be all end all, but it's like one in a progression
Yeah.
of better ways to do it. And articles have been
Right.
written. I said like even that could be doubt could be brought even to the carbon dating. So I can't prove it absolutely,
Yeah.
but I could say even the modern trends are going that starting to dispute carbon dating where it's not like end of conversation.
Right, right. It can be picking up other periods of its
Right.
life. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also where they got the sample from, because it was
Yeah.
held by the
Various
fungi
hairs,
that would have
things
been
like
on all
that.
the hands, and where they sewed it in, they had the cross sewing that the French nuns did. They sewed it in where it disappeared. They didn't even know where. So new pollens could have been introduced into could have been recording something that wasn't even part of the original Shroud.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting.
It's what the most studied artifact ever.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And we still.
But going back to the storytelling again, or finding that like harnessing a framework or a narrative is part of the way of, it's like a life preserver, because the truth is this is like the grassy knoll, this is study.
Yeah,
You could spend forever trying to say, once I get all of the knowledge, or I could read the future or capture the entire, it would be impossible. So by choosing a narrow trajectory,
Yeah.
which is what I did, and saying, if I could prove this, and this, then at least I could make it plausible. Then at least I opened the discussion to be, it's not, you can't dismiss it out of hand. That was kind of my limited scope to make the point
Yeah.
in the film
Yeah.
and tell it like a story so
Yeah.
people could see
Yeah, I
me
think that was
figuring it out.
helpful. I mean, like I said earlier, there's so many things out there, and I hate to say I've had to read a lot of those and watch a lot of those. But yours is different in that it's, I don't want to say this, interesting. Like
Go ahead, by the way. This is what directors look for.
Yeah, the narrative sweep gives it a way to get through the story without just beating people with, oh, here's another fact and here's another argument. And, after a while, you're just kind of, oh, for Pete's sake.
Right.
But the narrative and the personal element really helps move it along and gives it a framework to, okay, yeah, I see where you're going and track along with it. So, yeah, it was very well done. It's really appreciated.
Thank you. And you asked me that first question, like, why another one?
Yeah.
It was because I've never seen one like that.
Yeah. It's like, I want to prove this or I'm going to disprove this.
Yeah.
Let's kind of go around it this way. That's good. Yeah. So where can people learn more about your book and your video, your film?
www.theshroudfilm.com. They can actually subscribe now and see the film online. It's limited to our site, the website.
Okay.
They can order the book there also. Again, it's www.theshroudfilm.com. And we're coming out on March 28th on many platforms. It'll start expanding. And we're in the process of seeing if we get a theatrical release for it between now and then. So, and if not, maybe toward the fall. So.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Congratulations. And thank you so much, Robert, being here.
And thank you for joining us on Today at Museum of the Bible.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate
Thank you.
it. Yeah.
That was good.
Thank you for listening to Today at Museum of the Bible. Join us again to hear how authors, scholars, and leaders are engaging with the Bible every day. Only on Today at Museum of the Bible.